Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to take a few moments and allow people time to connect and join us. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. All right, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary's Stay at Home Speaker Series. Today's program is 2023 Hawk Mountain Raptor Migration Count Wrap Up with the one, the only David Barber, Hawk Mountain's Senior Research Biologist. Welcome,
Hi,
David.
everyone. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yay. All right. So my name is Jamie Dawson. I'm the Director of Education at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. As you may know, Hawk Mountain is the world's very first refuge for birds of prey. And we continue to work hard to be leaders in raptor conservation, science, and education, locally and globally. Hawk Mountain is a private nonprofit, and membership is the lifeblood of our organization. So, to all of our members out there, thank you so very much. We could not do what we do without your support. And if you're joining us today and you're not a member, well, we hope you consider becoming one in the future. But we're just happy you're here. um, so Hawk Mountain hopes that everyone's 2024 is off to a fabulous start with the new year. And we're thrilled to be able to offer our local and global community a variety of free virtual programming. But as always, Hawk Mountain greatly appreciates and depends on donations. At any point during today's program, viewers may submit their questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and we've designated some time at the end of the program to take some questions from the audience. And just so everyone is aware, this program is being recorded. The video will then be accessible on Hawk Mountain's YouTube channel as a continued resource. We also have a link on our website that can directly connect you to our YouTube channel. And I don't know about you all, but I'm super excited that David Barber is joining us today from the Acopian Center to share with us summaries, insights, and highlights from the 2023 migration season at Hawk Mountain. And before we go further, I always like to take a moment to share with our audience a bit about David's background experience. David holds a Master's of Science in Zoology and joined Hawk Mountain in 1999. He is responsible for collecting data in the field, managing our natural history databases, including our long-term raptor, bird, and butterfly counts, and for all sanctuary GIS mapping projects. He also conducts stewardship and monitoring programs, helps in conducting the annual count, and trains interns, particularly in wing tagging techniques and the use of mapping software. David is a talented birder by ear and skilled naturalist who often can be found out and about working to complete the breeding bird, butterfly, and other annual surveys on the sanctuary. And my personal favorite is that David is an award-winning brewer, and he's our resident beer connoisseur, and he enjoys working with his dog and being outdoors. So, David, it's always a pleasure. This is our annual tradition, the migration season wrap up. It's always a popular one. Um, so travel back in memory. You're at North Lookout in 2023 doing the count. Can you share with us and describe your most rewarding day at the lookout in 2023 and also your most challenging days and why?
So yeah, I was fortunate in that I was the counter on several really good days this year. So probably the most rewarding is when, we spot 31 bald eagles in a day or 2,400 broadwing hawks, and you get to share that with the public because it's very special for me. And I just can't imagine people who aren't used to seeing lots of birds, um, getting to show them and seeing their appreciation and just the awe when they see that many birds coming through at one time, is really special. The most challenging day, um, there's probably several. One is just that day when we had over 2,400 broadwings. The challenging part is trying to count birds when they're tiny little specks up in the clouds and you could barely see them, and you're trying not to miscount them, trying to count every single bird. But there are also those days when there are no birds. There's no wind, it's overcast, so there's no thermals. And those are the days that are really challenging because you have to constantly scan looking for birds because something's going to be migrating through. And it's just having to push yourself on those days when you're just not going to see much. So,
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I have to ask, going into the rewarding category, I heard a rumor that a special Hawk Mountain member brought pizza up to the counters on North Lookout. And I'm wondering, were you at the count that day or was that not your?
I was not.
Oh,
No, I put in my request, but I never did receive any pizza.
so everyone listening next year, Fridays, David's at the lookout.
Yes. Always the best days.
Yes, it's true.
Guaranteed.
So, David, what advice do you have anyone who might be out there listening, watching, who is interested in getting involved or, you know, heading on a career path to be involved with raptor conservation science? You've made a career out of doing this. What advice do you have for people?
First, if you're interested in biology, I would, get a degree in biology, but then probably more importantly is volunteer at a raptor conservation organization if possible, or become an intern and do an internship at an institution. Because that's really the way, one, you gain experience from professionals in the field. You also get contacts and you're able to network not only with professionals, but potentially other trainees or interns. So it's really a way to learn a lot from the professionals, and then they can also guide you in your future career decisions as well. So just making those connections and being able to network is really super important.
For sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. I'm going to turn it over to you and
Okay.
looking forward to hearing everything that happened during last year's migration.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for tuning in for the 2023 fall migration wrap up. It was very, anytime you can spend some time up on the rocks rather than in your office, it's a great day. And we had a good year this year. I do want to kind of give you a feel for what the count is like, what our numbers were like, and also how that compares to previous years, but also other sites in Pennsylvania as well. So this is our 89th year of counting. We rely on 5 staff and 15 dedicated volunteers. And our typical count or our official count season is August 15th through December 15th. But we always add a few days on late in the season because when we get those great wins late in the season, it could be really good for bald eagles and northern goshawks, or American goshawks, I should say. We spent a total of 124 days on the lookout, 11,000 or 1,119 hours. We counted 16 species of raptors, and our official count was 15,140 raptors counted over those 124 days, which is a little bit below average. But as I'll describe later, there's a lot of variation in the count from year to year. So just seeing the count below average one year really doesn't worry me so much. But we not only count raptors at Hawk Mountain, we count everything that is migrating. So that includes other birds, butterflies, dragonflies. So we actually counted over 66,000 other birds, non-raptors, that migrated past, nearly 1,300 butterflies. Yep, 1,300 butterflies. Most of them are monarchs, and then also 683 dragonflies. So the great thing about counting everything is on those days when it's slow raptor migration day, usually there's something to count and keep you busy. So I'll go through some of the species that were above average and some of the species that were below average, and why we think some of those species might have been below average this year and how that compares to previous years. So we had 3 species with above average counts this year: turkey vultures, bald eagles, and northern harriers. So 3 out of the 16 species had above average counts. We had 9 species that had below average counts: osprey, Cooper's hawk, American goshawk, red-shouldered hawk, broad-winged hawk, and red-tailed hawk. And then golden eagles, merlins, and kestrels were all below average this year. And then we had 4 species that had average counts: black vultures, sharp-shinned hawks, rough-legged hawks, and peregrine falcons. Now, it's really important to remember that, even though you may have had an above average count or below average count, it's really only 1 year's worth of data, and we are only one watch site. So the numbers that we collect on a yearly basis doesn't necessarily mean that the population is increasing or decreasing. It's really looking at long-term trends, and then also taking a broader perspective and looking at trends kind of throughout, say, Eastern North America. So the really exciting news about this year's count is we counted 639 bald eagles. That was a new record, which seems to be happening every few years. The count was 21% above average, and our high count was October 15th when we had 31 bald eagles go through. We also had several days with 20 to 28 bald eagles. So when I started back in 1999, our high count was, I think it was 190 for the year. So in as little as 24 years, that count has tripled to 639 birds. So if we look at our long-term trends, this is what we see. After DDT was banned in the 70s, we've seen an increase in the population, averaging in the last 10 years about 6% increase per year in just the last 10 years. And we're not the only site in Pennsylvania that is counting raptors. So we have, this is Hawk Mountain right here, And so there are many other watch sites in Pennsylvania, and these are, whenever you see a blue arrow, that means the site had an above average count, and if it has a red arrow pointing down, it had a below average count. So we're not the only site in Pennsylvania that is seeing an increase in the numbers of bald eagles migrating through. It was virtually every watch site in Pennsylvania, with the exception of one down near Philadelphia, had above average counts this year. And if we look at even taking a broader perspective, this is data from the Raptor Population Index with trends over the last 10 years for bald eagles. And wherever you see a green arrow pointing up, those are sites that have shown an increasing number of bald eagles migrating through. And the blue dots are stable population or stable numbers. And then the down arrow, red down arrow, is a decline in the numbers. So you can see kind of throughout Eastern North America, virtually every watch site except one is either showing increasing numbers of bald eagles migrating through, or the populations are stable. Northern harriers were above average. We had 131. They were 6% above average, which again, it's just 1 year, but it's certainly promising, because when we look at the long-term trends for the numbers of harriers that are moving past Hawk Mountain, we see that there's a decline in the numbers in the last 20 years or so. And in the last 10 years, probably a decline of about 4.5% per year. And if we look at kind of throughout Pennsylvania, we see kind of a mixed bag. Some sites had below average counts, some had above average counts, and this yellow horizontal arrows mean that they had an average count this year. So harriers are kind of one of the odd species that they don't tend to stay on the ridge. You know, our best days are when we have northwest winds. It creates a lot of updrafts on the north slope, and the birds glide on those updrafts. But the harriers don't seem to stay necessarily along the ridges. They will cut across and go across the valley. So could be why there's a lot of variation in the counts, just because of the topography at those different sites. However, if we start looking at the long-term trends, not only at Hawk Mountain, but kind of Eastern North America, we can get a better idea of what the population is doing. And what we see is there's a lot of red arrows pointing down. So we're seeing, I think it's somewhere around 38% of the watch sites in Eastern North America that are showing declining numbers of harriers moving through. So this is when we start looking at, and this is data from the last 10 years, again, from the Rapid Population Index. And so this is when we start to say, you know, there might be something wrong in the population. Reproductive success probably is not very high. And one way we can look at what might be causing these declining numbers, you know, whenever we have a declining number any particular year, it could be due to several factors. It could just be due to winds or environmental conditions that year. It could be due to an actual change in the population, or it could be due to birds taking a different migratory route. So when we look at these numbers and see a lot of declines at watch sites throughout the Eastern North America, we start looking at what might explain this. And so one of the things we can look at is Christmas bird count data. Christmas bird counts are an annual count that's conducted in the wintertime. And if we look at those numbers for harriers, we see that there's not an increase in harriers in the wintertime in the Northeast, which if the birds were just not migrating, we would expect to see more in the wintertime. We're not seeing that with harriers. So that may suggest that there is something, the birds are having lower reproductive success, and so there's fewer harriers out there. So it's actually a negative trend in the population. The other increasing species, the species that had above average counts, are turkey vultures. You know, one of our favorite raptors at Hawk Mountain, because when there's nothing flying, there's almost always turkey vultures moving around. We counted 965 vultures. The count was up 35%. And this was actually our second highest count ever for turkey vultures this year. One of the amazing things is that, you know, we have three species. Our three most abundant species are broadwing hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and red-tailed hawks. And now we're starting to see turkey vultures inching closer to that. They're probably in the fourth spot now. They're inching ever closer to that number 3 species. So it's certainly possible in the next 5 years that, you know, our top 3 species may be broadwing hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and turkey vultures. And we'll just have to see as the counts go on. Now, again, what I mentioned is, you know, there's several factors that may influence numbers of migrating hawks that you find in a year, that you count in a year. You know, it could be weather conditions, taking different migratory routes, lower reproductive success, or, you know, an actual trend in the population. And so we want to investigate why we had some declines in the numbers we're seeing. So broadwing hawks is a good example. We had counted 767,365 birds this year. Our high count was just over 2,500 in September 22nd, and that was a little bit below average. And if you look back at our total for the season, that was 7% below average as well. So really, broadwing hawks and our counts of broadwings really dictate how well overall count is going to be, just because they are our most numerous raptor that migrates through. So if you look at the trends in broadwing hawks, they're pretty stable. You can tell there's a tremendous amount of variation. And this is not only our most abundant migrant, but our most variable migrant as well. The broadwing hawks form large flocks, we call them kettles, and the majority of birds move through in about a 10-day period in right around the third week in September, say September 14th through the 22nd. So it really depends on the weather conditions that is happening during that 10-day period, whether we tend to see a lot of broadwing hawks or not. So this is how we see broadwings. They're forming large flocks that are high up in the sky. The thermals are really strong, producing those rising columns of hot air that they use to form these large kettles. They can be so high that they're very difficult to see. So here's a short video of some broadwings over North Lookout. And we don't try and count them when they're circling like that. We count them when they rise to the top of the thermal. They stream out of the thermal and slowly lose altitude, and we're counting them as they're coming out of that thermal. But you can imagine if these birds aren't very high at all, they're very easy to count, very easy to see. But if you had birds that were very high on a day just like this with no clouds, they're very, very difficult to count and to see at all. So it's really the environmental conditions during that time. And this year, we had lots of days with clear blue skies. So it's certainly possible that we missed some birds. But we also had a lot of days with northwest winds that are coming out of the northwest. And what that does is it kind of pushes the broadwings off the ridge. So a lot of the birds are more in kind of eastern Pennsylvania. So we can see when we look at the trends from sites in Pennsylvania, again, here's North Lookout. We saw a below average count, and those northwest winds seem to push most of the birds further to the east. And so Militia Hill, this watch site down here, actually had a day of over 22,000 broadwings, which was right in our peak, where we'd expect to see them at North Lookout if we had some good winds. Fortunately, there was, I believe it was Hurricane Lee was coming up the coast. And so what we did was all of a sudden we had southeast winds kind of later during that 10-day period. And that's when we had our big count of 2,400 birds. So luckily those birds were pushed back and we did have a decent count for that day. Now, environmental conditions can also affect other species. The golden eagle, which is one of our late season migrants, they peak in the first 2 weeks of November. We counted 101 golden eagles, and that count was 18% below average. But this fall was the warmest fall on record. And typically, if you're a migrating bird, one of the reasons why you do migrate is lack of food. So with this warm weather and very little snow cover up north, it probably allowed the bald eagles to spend longer time up north rather than starting to migrate. And there's a watch site in central Pennsylvania called Bald Eagle Mountain, and they record the largest numbers of golden eagles moving through the state. It's a very young site. They've only been counting 4 years. But what they saw this year compared to previous years is a large number of golden eagles moving through in late December, which is after when our count ends. So it's certainly possible that the warm weather, lack of snow cover, allowed the golden eagles to stay further north on their breeding grounds and not move through during migration. So we did have, several counts that were late in the season when we did have, after the official count ended, when we had some good northwest winds, and we did see some golden eagles on those counts. So it's certainly possible that there's nothing wrong with the population. We just didn't count them. They just haven't moved through yet. And if we look at the trends in golden eagles at Hawk Mountain, we can see that over the last 30 years, they have been an increase in the number of birds that we've been recording. And it's only, the last couple years where we've seen some warmer weather and lower counts. So we aren't the only watch site. Every site in Pennsylvania had below average counts this year. And it's probably, again, due to the birds just didn't move through yet. They certainly moved through later in the season after the counts were ended. Excuse me. So Cooper's hawks, one of those species that eats other birds. They tend to hang out at bird feeders a lot. They were a count of 350 and 21% below average. And again, 1 year doesn't make a lot of difference, but we're starting to see decreasing numbers of Cooper's hawks at Hawk Mountain, particularly over the last 20 years. We're seeing a decline. And again, this year in Pennsylvania, there's been most of the sites have shown declines or below average counts. A few that have average counts and one above average. And we're starting, if we look at a wider view from the Raptor Population Index, we see, a variety of either sites are declining, but most of the sites are fairly stable. And if we look at, I should back up. So one of the things we can look at is, as I mentioned previously, is looking at Christmas bird count data. And when we start looking at Christmas bird count data, we see that there actually has been an increase in the number of Cooper's hawks in the states. So, and with an average increase of about 2% per year. So this would suggest that there isn't necessarily anything wrong with the population. They're not declining. It's just that the birds aren't migrating as far as they used to, or have stopped migrating, something that we call short stopping. So the same could be said for these changes in migratory patterns for red-tailed hawks, which were down 35%, counting just under 1,000. We've seen those red-tailed hawks have shown long-term declines over the last 20 years. Red-shouldered hawks are also declining as well, or the numbers that we're seeing are declining, I should say. Our count of red shoulders was down 29%. And that's another species that are seeing increases in Christmas bird counts. So again, suggesting that the birds are changing their migratory behavior, not necessarily that the population itself is declining. However, there are those species that are showing long-term population declines, not only at Hawk Mountain, but other sites. Osprey are a really good example. I remember when I first came here and started counting, September, you would have those days with strong northwest winds, and we would call them osprey parades. Birds would just pop up over the slope of 5 moving towards us, and you could look back and you would just see 2 or 3, 4 ospreys just one after another moving through. And those days have ended. We haven't seen a really high osprey day in quite a while. Our count this year was 30% below our 10-year average. And you can see the trend over the last 30 years or so, a steady decline. All the sites in Pennsylvania had below average counts this year, and it's something that we're seeing year after year. If we look at kind of a broader northeastern North America site, we see a lot of red arrows showing declines. We do see along the coast that Cape May had an increase or an above average count, or are showing increases in number of osprey they're counting. And a lot of the sites along the coast are fairly stable population numbers. So one of the suggestions is that we're seeing a decline in osprey because we're seeing an increase in bald eagles. So those inland sites where we're seeing an increase in bald eagles, they're actually excluding osprey from prime habitat. And along the coast where they tend to nest more colonially, that the ospreys are actually able to kind of outcompete bald eagles in those areas. So the populations there tend to be fairly stable. So that would suggest that those in that case, osprey are actually showing a population decline. If we looked at Christmas bird count data, we don't see an increase in the numbers, and osprey are actually a complete migrant. So virtually the entire population migrates south out of the breeding grounds. So the same could be said for several other species, that it's probably low reproductive success and a declining population, a reason why we're seeing declining numbers of birds counted at Hawk Mountain. American goshawk is one of those species. We only counted 5 this year. I remember the first, I think it was my first day on the lookout in '99. I actually counted 16 goshawks, which I've never seen that many again. And I only saw a few this year. I was lucky enough to see one of the only 2 adult goshawks that moved through this year. So it's 56% below average. We're also seeing long-term declines in American kestrels. Our kestrel numbers were down 19% this year. So it's really looking at these long-term trends at various sites and doing kind of a large analysis that allows us to make, allows us to look at population trends and try and suggest what might be causing those trends. But as I mentioned before, not to be, I don't want to be too gloomy. We did have a really great season at North Lookout. And as I mentioned earlier, we count everything. So these are our top 5 non-raptors. Canada geese, they tend to not necessarily stick on the ridge, but fly over the ridge, moving north-south. We had a lot of cedar waxwings, just under 7,000, moving through in flocks. Could be, up to, 60, 70, almost 100 birds in a flock. Common grackles, we do have a really good movement of blackbirds moving through, and common grackles are our most abundant blackbirds. I say blackbirds, those are red-winged blackbirds, cowbirds, starlings, and grackles. American robins are always in our top 5, and blue jays as well. We had a really good blue jay year. I think our high count was near 700, a little over 700 one day. And what's really cool about seeing migrating blue jays is everybody's probably used to blue jays. They make a lot of noise and they're constantly calling, but when they're migrating, they're completely silent. So it's just amazing seeing these blue jays fly just at treetops, 200, 300 individuals flying past and just being absolutely quiet.
David, can I interrupt
Yes.
with a question just about that slide that came in? Someone wanted to know what time of year or what's the time frame to see all the waxwings?
They'll start moving through in September in good numbers, and they have a kind of a long protracted migration. So probably the biggest numbers are in September though.
Cool, thank you.
Yep, you bet. So one of the really cool things about being up at North Lookout and watching the non-raptors is sometimes you never know what you're going to see. And this year was one of those years. We actually had a wood stork soaring high over North Lookout in late August, August 31st, I think. And, what is a wood stork doing way up here? If you look at the range of wood storks, the purple in this map is where they're resident year round. The red is where they're breeding range, and the blue is the non-breeding range. So these are birds from the south. They're typically found in wetlands. And what was one doing at North Lookout? This was our first record in 89 years of a wood stork being seen at North Lookout. But it wasn't the only really unusual bird that we saw at North Lookout. We also saw an anhinga, which is again is another bird species that tend to find them in wooded wetlands, swamps, in the southeast. So again, the red is the breeding range, purple is year-round resident range. So again, this was our fourth record of anhinga at North Lookout. The wood stork is really odd because there was really no climatological events that the bird got blown far north. But for the anhinga, it was Hurricane Lee that was moving up the coast, and I forget exactly where the hurricane was along the coast, but it was in that time period when Hurricane Lee was off the coast that we saw the anhinga at North Lookout. So the wood stork could possibly that it was an immature bird that was dispersing in the wrong direction. It's just hard to know. But seeing really unusual birds is something that you always have to keep an eye out for at North Lookout. One of the great things about North Lookout in late August, early September, we get a very good songbird migration for about the first 2 hours after sunrise. Best days are when there's very little wind, but we get a tremendous number of songbirds moving through. We saw 22 species of warblers this year. We had counts of over 100 Cape May warblers in a day, lots of Blackburnian warblers. So it's really cool the first 2 hours after sunrise, when we can just see waves of songbirds moving through the vegetation. They're often right at eye level as they move through the vegetation. So it's a very, very cool sight to see these large flocks moving through. And some other species that were unusual this year, we saw sandhill cranes a few days, which they seem to be popping up more and more along the ridge. We also saw a flock of black scoters, which are typically you see them off the coast in the wintertime. This was a day in December when we had our best waterfowl flights with thousands of Canada geese, lots of snow geese, tundra swans, mallards, just a really tremendous waterfowl flight day. We also had a really high count for red-headed woodpeckers. They were above average this year. Seeing both adults, as in this picture here, as well as immatures. And this year was also a really good year for pine siskins. The white spruce crop in the boreal forest was really poor. So we started seeing siskins I think the first couple were in September, but the real numbers were moving through in October, in December, or in November. And our high count, I think, was 539 siskins in one day. So it wasn't a great year for winter finches, other than pine siskins. We did see a few red crossbills, white-winged crossbills, and red poles, but not in large numbers. But it was a really, really good year for pine siskins. So I do want to point out that being up on the lookout for 124 days and over 1,100 hours, it takes a village, and I'm fortunate to have a great staff of hawk watchers here that do the counting, but also a lot of dedicated volunteers. Some of those challenging days are days when you're not seeing a lot of birds, and we have to ask our volunteers to sit up there and count even when conditions aren't great. So I'm very fortunate to have a good core group of hawk watching volunteers, as well as some assistants, that people that tend to come up when counts are good. And usually the more eyes you have up there, the better. So it really does take a lot of people to pull off this count. And I want to thank all of them that participated this year. So with that, I will be happy to answer any questions.
David, thank you so much. I always look forward to this program because I learned so much from it and I love it. Yeah, and how about that wood stork?
I
That was,
know.
I had someone call me about it. I was like, what? Okay, so we do have one question that came in early on when you first started, and it's kind of asking about, it's more like a statement, but maybe asking for your comments about it, about the fires from Canada. Okay, a conversation I'm not hearing out there is what impact have the forest fires of Canada this past summer, how they may have affected migration numbers? Here in Vermont, we are not seeing anything close to overwintering bird species that we have had in the past. I attribute that to the possible loss of successful fledglings and even adult birds that succumb to the forest fires. Any comments about that, David?
It's we thought that early on, it seemed like um, the count was, especially for sharp-shinned hawks, was later. And we weren't seeing, it didn't seem like we saw as many immatures, which could suggest that it was low reproductive success. But I haven't dove into those numbers. And if that was the case, we would also expect to see sharp-shinned hawk numbers kind of below average everywhere. And this year our count was average. Um, and I think for Pennsylvania, it was kind of all over the map. Some were above average, some were below average. So um, not really sure how much of an impact the wildfires did have.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I don't see too many questions coming in. I think your presentation was so thorough, and I'll just,
It wowed them.
yes, you did. Um, so we mentioned about you were talking about interns and getting traineeships for people that are interested in doing this as a career. But what about people who just would like to volunteer and help assist with the count or help process data? What words do you have for people that might want to be involved with the count on a voluntary basis?
I would say contact me. And the best way to learn your birds is to spend a lot of time on the lookout, and then surround yourself with other good hawk watchers. So coming up to North Lookout, you know, all the hawk watchers are friendly, all the counters are friendly. So hang around by the pit, where the pit is where we count the hawks. And then, just ask questions. We're not, you just ask, why do you think it's a sharp-shinned hawk and not a Cooper's hawk? Or, what are the differences between the two? And we'll be happy, if it's not a really busy day, we'd be happy to help you along, as well as we'll have trainees up there as well that would be willing to help out as well.
David, thank you so much.
No
Um,
problem.
and thank you to everyone for joining us. And as always, before I sign off, I'd like to give you a little preview of what's coming up, events at Hawk Mountain, because even though it's January or maybe February as of tomorrow, we still have a lot going on. So our Winter Artisan Series starts this weekend, and we collaborate with local artists who come in and they share their talents, and their crafts. And we have that basically every weekend going on all the way through March. So that's a lot of our programs. Let's see, for this weekend, we have Writing the Sanctuary. That's a workshop on Saturday, and Sunday we have a Tree of Life Suncatcher. On February 6th, we have a Breakfast with the Birds event. On February 10th, we have our Spring Egg Basket Workshop for our Winter Artisan Series. And February 17th, we have our traditional hooked rug coasters workshop. And on February 24th, we have our coffee painting workshop, which is always a hit with David Hughes. And February 25th, Yoga on the Mountain. That's a fun one. And also on the 25th, we have our kids paint pour. So that's it for now. And thank you everyone for joining us. David, thank you again very much. And have a wonderful rest of your evening. And we hope to see you at Hawk Mountain soon. Bye for now.
Bye.